Our world has undeniably been shaped by the process of colonization, which swept through and sought to dominate wholly the people and places of this planet for the benefit and prestige of imperial rulers, capitalist exploiters, and settler colonists. Entire cultures and ecologies were ruthlessly subjugated by these colonizing forces over the centuries, and the scars these mad brutes have left on the social, political, economic, and physical landscape cannot be ignored. Though by no means unique to Europeans, as every empire in history from Rome to Assyria to China to Mali to Umayyad to Aztec sought to dominate and expand its reach through earlier iterations of colonialism, the process of European colonialism has undeniably done the most damage to the most people in the shortest period of time. The empires of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, France, and Britain especially, though not exclusively, would globalize the practice of modern colonialism, establishing both its historical and ongoing form of occupation and exploitation. And yes, I consider it ongoing. The post in post-colonialism is indeed silent. Although the mid to late 20th century is widely celebrated as the era of decolonization, I believe that the process has largely failed and colonialism has endured in forms old and new. I'm not the first to broach this topic, but I'd like to share my understanding of colonialism as a colonial subject in a Caribbean context and explore what I believe successful decolonization looks like. Any discussion of decolonization must inevitably begin with an understanding of colonialism, in particular, its four most well-known overlapping classifications: settler colonialism, exploitation colonialism, surrogate colonialism, and internal colonialism. Settler colonialism involves the large-scale migration of settlers to a region in order to establish permanent settlements and supplant the existing indigenous population. Settler colonialism can have religious, political, or economic motivations, but the result is still the same: the domination, assimilation, marginalization, or elimination of the indigenous population. It is the process of destroying to replace. It is empire and colony wrapped into one geographical space. Examples include the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, Canada, Uruguay, New Zealand, Russia, South Africa, and Israel, among others. In some cases post-independence, settler colonies may begin to lose their status as settler colonies in modern discourse, either due to the mass exodus of their settler population, see for example Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Algeria, or the increased political representation of their indigenous population, see for example Bolivia and South Africa. Exploitation colonialism involves less actual settlement of colonists and more of let's take and take and take. Whether colonies of occupation, like India and Hong Kong, or plantation colonies, as in the Caribbean, they set up trading posts, colonial governments, and colonial enterprises to extract and exploit as much labor and as many natural resources as possible for the benefit of the metropole. For the most part, that's how colonialism went down in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Surrogate colonialism involves a settler colonial project supported by a colonial power, where most of the settlers do not come from the same ethnic group as the ruling power. The most well-known example of surrogate colonialism can be found in the settlement of Palestine, where the British government gave Jewish settlers rights over a land already occupied by indigenous Palestinians. Internal colonialism refers to the exploitation of minority groups, creating political and economic inequalities between regions within a state. In the archipelagic nation of the Philippines, Filipinos outside of the capital province of Manila have expressed their frustrations with the political, economic, cultural, and linguistic impositions of the capital, summarizing the expression, "Not a leaf can fall in our country without Malacanang's permission." In this video, I'll be focusing on the first two overlapping types of colonialism: settler and exploitation. In both forms, I believe there are three major acts which take place: acts of enclosure, acts of possession, and acts of administration. Beginning with acts of enclosure, it is the process in which colonial powers, through the use or threat of violent force, dispossess the existing inhabitants of the land, create new colonial commons for the benefit of settlers, and later enclose that land and its resources within the institution of private property for the benefit of capital. It is a process of occupation and restructuring people's relation to the land and resources from an overlapping quilt of commons governed by the distinct land use rules of various indigenous societies to one of private, colonial ownership and control, laying the groundwork for the modern state. Particularly in the case of settler colonialism, acts of enclosure are driven both by the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of new livelihoods for settlers through the erasure of the livelihoods of the indigenous. In both forms of colonialism, acts of enclosure are justified in a cultural discourse that assigns colonizing forces the position of civilization and colonial subjects the position of savagery, incapable of using the land properly. Historically, colonial subjects were either indigenous to the land of the colony or brought in as slaves or indentured labor by the colonial power. In both forms of colonialism, the occupying force aims to exploit the resources and labor of the colony, creating disastrous human and ecological consequences that reverberate over generations. Acts of possession are common practice in the process of colonialism. Before, during, or after acts of enclosure, colonial powers claim their newly acquired territory through what American historian Patricia is called Ceremonies of Possession, in her book, Ceremonies of Possession, which includes naming to establish the legitimacy of their claims. Quote, French, Spanish, and Dutch settlers both named and claimed to possess through naming. Portuguese settlers recognized naming as a means of establishing power, but viewed it as an oppressive form of colonialism. English rulers disparaged naming as a legitimate claim, with the ironic result of retaining a considerable number of indigenous names simply because naming was not pivotal to establishing colonial authority. Naming practices carry the weight of generations of cultural history, sense of place, and right to belong. There's a political dimension to names. By erasing the indigenous legacy of a place, flora, or fauna by their name, colonial powers are able to write out the native from the cartography, taxonomy, and topography of a region. Possession via naming can also extend to the so-called Christianization of names for indigenous children, erasing their cultural legacy. There are, of course, exceptions where indigenous names have been somewhat retained, such as Lake Tanganyika and the islands of Jamaica and Sumatra. However, it's important to note that even in those cases, what becomes the official place name is ultimately determined by colonial powers, irrespective of the names that other indigenous peoples may have assigned those territories. Take the Mississippi River, for instance. The Choctaw called it Michissipokni, and the Wyandot called it Yandaweswe, but most only know it as Mississippi because the French said so. Acts of possession by colonial powers help us to control and legitimize their theft. The persistence of these names today serve as symbolic reminders of their continued domination of people and place. Finally, acts of administration are the ways in which colonial powers manage their territories economically, politically, and socially. Speaking generally, colonial rule brought colonies into a global market that would displace existing subsistence, non-monetary, and gift economies, including private ownership of the means of production for the sake of profit, price systems, and, after the abolition of slavery and the end of indentureship, wage labor. Colonial governments superseded pre-existing governance systems as well, which included hierarchical and horizontal arrangements alike, in favor of the indirect and disenfranchised models of governance that dominated the colonial period. Even post-universal suffrage, the people were still deprived of meaningful access to the administration of their own affairs. Besides introducing the legislative system that would validate the acts of enclosure that established private property and cut people off from accessing the means of subsistence, colonial governance also introduced the executive system that would strictly enforce that legislation and repress any resistance to colonial authority through persecution and incarceration. They would also enforce the Western patriarchal values that had come to override indigenous patriarchal and gender egalitarian systems alike, maintain a racial and complexion-based hierarchy that established new dimensions of social stratification, and impose the conservative religious and moral standards that would support cultural and queer persecution alike. Speaking of religion, it's no secret that the church was an extension of colonial authority, often charged with the administration of the education system, which would play a hand in developing social stratification, racial and ethnic division, religious indoctrination, internalized self-denigration, cultural marginalization, popular pacification, and propaganda. These colonial-era acts of administration have introduced enduring systems and institutions that scar the social, political, and economic landscape of independent colonies. The era of independence in the mid to late 20th century came as a result of the rising tide of national liberation movements, anti-colonial international opinion, and the impact of the Second World War. Achieving formal independence took on two major forms: constitutional and armed. The constitutional method of independence saw colonial powers collaborating with nationalist leaders to ease the transition towards complete political independence, whereas the armed method of independence saw the use of force of arms and bloodshed to achieve their aims. Sometimes both methods were used, either beginning with armed struggle and ending with constitutional independence, or beginning with the constitutional method but resorting to armed resistance. Many factors would have gone into which route various colonies took to gain their independence. For example, the type of colonialism in place would play a role. Former settler colonies like Algeria and Kenya had to pick up weapons to force settlers out and eventually gain independence. In exploitation colonies of waning profitability, increasing liability, and decades of outbursts of proletarian, peasantry, and nationalist frustration, such as in the British West Indies, constitutional means were used, which also helped ensure that the transfer of power was made to those largely loyal to British interests. The economic and political position of the colonial power would also help determine the method of independence, best seen in the case of the very broke Portuguese Empire. Independence for their colonies in Africa would mean economic suicide for Portugal, hence the 13-year-long Portuguese colonial war that would conclude the independence of Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, and the military coup in mainland Portugal in 1974. Ongoing settler colonial projects, such as the US, have long been formally independent, but despite some reforms and civil rights here and there thanks to centuries of struggle by the black and indigenous lower classes, their marginalization endures and the settler colonial project has not yet concluded. So, why do I say that the project of decolonization stands incomplete? Fully self-aware of the irony, I'm going to quote the words of former Trinbagonian Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams. Here then is the reality of independence. Seeking to deal with our problems on a national scale and in an international context with a mentality conceived in slavery, cradled in indenture, and nurtured in colonialism. The question is, have we overcome the mentalities, institutions, and systems that have been conceived in slavery, cradled in indenture, and nurtured in colonialism? The fact is that Dr. Williams' government, like many post-colonial governments, failed to adequately confront and challenge the persistence of colonialism in an independent nation. By the very nature of their position in that system, they could not. We, and I'm speaking primarily of the Caribbean and Africa here, have continued echoing the institutions, attitudes, and customs of our overlords. Independent leaders may have paid lip service to anti-colonial rhetoric, but they were far more concerned with proving themselves fit to rule on the international stage. They had very little interest in, respect for, or trust in the capacity of the masses to steer their own course. Independence is only the beginning of our struggle. The translation of power from old empires to our new successor states has meant little more than the theatre of raising an independent flag, the stagnation of revolutionary momentum, and the consolidation of local ruling classes' hold in both state and capitalism. It is not enough post-independence to claim to be against colonialism, to be against colonial powers. There must be an effort to be for something, to channel our collective energy as liberated people toward creative solutions and new institutions that serve our cultural, social, political, and economic needs. That should be the aim of decolonization if it's really supposed to be about the freedom and self-determination of colonized people. These systems were not built for our benefit. They were not built for our sovereignty. The acts of enclosure, possession, and administration that defined our colonial reality cannot be maintained if we are to co-create a new decolonial reality. So, how do I think we should decolonize? Well, we can't return to pre-colonial time. Such a thing is impossible and in some ways frankly undesirable. What we need to do is to challenge the acts that brought our colonial situation into being. We need to begin to build new commons to overturn the acts of enclosure. We need to redefine how we relate to our spaces and ourselves to overturn the acts of possession. And we need to undertake a process of social revolution to overturn the acts of administration that have confined our social, political, and economic life. The process of land back and establishing new commons will enable us to dismantle the acts of enclosure that have carved up our landscapes and abolish the stratification of owners and tenants that places the majority at a political and economic disadvantage. Through the restoration of the sovereignty of colonized people and a revitalization of the way that we relate to the land, we can re-inhabit the social ecological web. Through the reintroduction and expansion of social ownership, maintained by clearly defined boundaries, conflict resolution mechanisms, and collectively determined rules, we can ensure that everyone has access to the means of subsistence and production necessary to support a good quality of life, one that has been withheld from us by the designations of private control. For more on this topic, you can check out my videos on the commons, on land back, and on the library economy. Symbolic decolonization will empower us to take control of our spaces and identities, refusing to limit our spatial and cultural understanding to the narrow confines of colonial possession. There must be a concerted and sustained effort to confront those visible and symbolic aspects of the legacy of colonial rule, lest our streets, squares, cities, rivers, and forests remain forever stained with the memory of their colonial inscribers. And yet, at the same time, we may need to recognize the ways that those colonial inscriptions have been subverted by their victims and reclaimed as their own. Such instances also deserve careful interrogation. Colonial acts of administration have established enduring social, political, and economic systems, institutions, and attitudes. Deconstructing those acts and constructing new ways of being will require social revolution, one that seeks to alter the whole character of society. For more information, you can check out my video on the subject, but in summary, social revolution refers to a complete transformation of our society, economy, culture, philosophy, technology, relationships, and politics. It is an ongoing and heterogeneous change in people's powers, drives, and consciousness, as well as a progressive breakdown and transformation of existing systems and institutions, punctuated by major ruptures and advances, all with the aim of self-liberation. It takes confrontation with the powers that be, non-cooperation with the established order of things, and prefiguration of new social relations, institutions, infrastructure, and practices in the here and now. All of these acts of decolonization must occur concurrently. Land back without symbolic decolonization would be maintaining the signifiers of colonial possession and domination even after we've escaped their grip. Symbolic decolonization without social revolution would just change the appearance of our situation on the surface, but not the deeper relationships, institutions, and systems defined by colonial powers. Decolonization entails a process of deconstruction and a process of reconstruction, particularly of the ways we relate to one another socially, politically, economically, culturally, and spatially. It takes questioning everything and drawing our answers from the past, the present, and the future. It takes the knowledge, experience, and input of all of us. I struggled a lot with writing this video because it's difficult to not have a discussion about decolonization feel incomplete. This video is not the be-all and end-all of thought, nor is it the only way of understanding decolonization. The way I view decolonization is heavily influenced by my anarchism. And so this video is really just an attempt at throwing my thoughts, however incomplete, into the ever-evolving conversation and action. But no matter what, free we until it backwards. All power to all the people. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks once again, of course, to the family, including our newest members, Zyra, Schneed, Troy Wiley, Colin Hendy, Cara the physicist, Nathan St. Pierre, and Daniel Volkman. Join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/sainttrue. Check out all my other videos for a range of radical topics. Follow me on Twitter @_sainttrue. Thanks again. Peace.